Mentioned, just to extend Tony Paul's apologies, he had to be out of the country today, this week, so he asked me to present on his behalf. Okay, so I'd just like to say it's a pleasure to be here. As mentioned, I'm a petroleum geoscientist, so this is my first exposure to the Professional Engineering Institution and Association in Trinidad, and it's good to hear that you all are considering sustainability in your technical conference. So we all know that the government of Trinidad and Tobago they have a significant that takes place in Trinidad and Tobago, right? When considering this, when we think of sustainability, more than 50% of the government's revenue actually comes from the oil and gas industry. So it has to be considered. The present situation in industry is that oil production has been in sharp decline for a number of years. The most recent Ryder Scott report, the results of that released by the Minister of Energy, has also shown that we are in decline. However, there's at least one person in the audience here with me that is hoping for a change of situation, Mr. Lashley from the Ministry of Energy. With the upcoming activity, we have exploration in the deep water, the ultra-deep exploration blocks with BHP. So while oil and gas is a transitionary industry, there are ups and downs, we do have to recognize that reserves are finite. Okay, this is a non-renewable resource, and eventually we will get to the point where the reserves that we have cannot sustain the level of expenditure that we've become accustomed to in this country. I'm not sure how many of you would have heard, I think it was probably about 2 weeks ago, the leaders of the G8, they announced that they will be phasing out the use of fossil fuels by the turn of the century. So we're all Trinidadians here. We know this is going to have a big impact on Trinidad and Tobago. Okay? So this is the big question. Is it possible to have a sustainable future? And if so, how? How do we do this? Diversification, definitely. How do we do this? The best practice that we can think of is to make sure that we can maximize the resources that we're generating from our depleting reserves and transfer that into sectors that will be sustainable, will have a high impact, and will have a long impact on our economy. Because as oil and gas decreases, we're going to need the other sectors, the support sectors, to indeed take the economy forward into the next 100 years. We believe that local content has a significant role to play in this. If we don't invest in how are we going to sustain ourselves in the future once oil and gas is gone? I don't think we have that. I don't think we're too focused on agriculture right now. These are things that we have to put in place so that when oil and gas makes its transition out, that we are prepared. Okay. I'm just speaking off the cuff here, so I may not be in sync with the slides. So as I mentioned, yes, it's important to manage the sector. Firstly, we have to make sure that we're actually capturing as much of the resources from the oil and gas industry as possible. We know that a lot of companies evade taxes, and this has a significant effect on what is left in Trinidad for us to develop our sectors on. We also, as part of this sustainable thrust, have to make sure that we build capacity and strengthen the other sectors. Especially, this is a wide group here, this is a broad audience. There's an engineering sector, there's manufacturing, there's finance, there's education, there's maritime, and all of these sectors will have to take us into the future. Tony Paul has spent quite a number of years deliberating on local content, both here and internationally. I myself did some consultancy work for the government of Nigeria and the government of Ghana most recently this year. They are very, very focused on how they can maximize local content. In their situation, they are battling the resource curse. Ghana in particular, they've recently found a significant amount of oil and gas, and they don't want to end up like their neighbors where As soon as a country encounters oil and gas, people from the surrounding sectors and the support sectors leave. They leave the agricultural sector, they leave the manufacturing sector. Everyone wants to be involved in oil and gas, but that does not make for a sustainable economy. Our situation in Trinidad is a bit different. We've been in oil and gas for the last 100 years, and with recent developments, with the thrust to move away from fossil fuels, we now have to think about sustainability beyond that 100 years. Okay. So in the talk today, I'll discuss a little bit more about this. I'll go into exactly what local content is, what it means for us. I'll also discuss government procurement, which has a major role to play in sustainable development and in incorporating local content policies and practices. And I'll talk a little bit about what the Trinidad and Tobago Local Content Chamber, the initiatives they've done and put in place to push this, to thrust this forward. Okay, local content. What is it? It's the value of input that's contributed by local suppliers in terms of materials, skills, services, and finances. We try to encourage people to think of local content more in terms of a dollar value, because oftentimes developing countries might think, okay, well, it's the amount of people that's involved in a certain project. A lot of multinationals know how to play that game. They will employ 80%, if you want 80% local content and you want 80% of the workers to be local, great. We'll make sure they're the water providers, they'll make tea, they will be doing the lower level activities. They're not necessarily going to be involved in the strategic thinking and management of the businesses unless the country that is demanding local content puts those things in place and demands, okay, this is exactly what we want local content to be, this is how we're getting our value. So transferring it to actual dollar value makes it easy to make sure that you're actually getting a high percentage of the wage bill when it comes down to it. To support local content and capacity development, this doesn't just naturally happen. Sustainability has to be our prerogative. Investors from abroad have their own goals. It's in their interest to have as much money go back to their countries because they're interested in building their people, their companies, their country. We also have to have this goal in mind. So, local content and capacity development, it requires experience, which is also going to require investment. Local companies, many of the engineers here, if people have their own engineering companies, you're going to recognize that it's important for you to be able to compete for tenders in a fair way, to have a fair chance to participate. There was an example a few years ago. The service companies in the oil and gas industry, they had been supporting the multinationals for quite a number of years. They had gotten their services up to international standards. The system was working fine. Then, I think it was, well, I won't name the multinational, but there was a global deal struck with an international service company that was able to provide them with better rates globally, and they made a global decision to be getting these services from this international company, and the entire service sector in the oil and gas industry was affected. A lot of people lost jobs, a lot of businesses had to close down. It's having a real impact on Trinidad and Tobago, and those things can only happen if we don't have the personal, the private, the public, and the political will to change it and to embrace sustainability. Government, because of their size and because they have such a large impact on the economy, it's important that they engage strategic procurement practices that facilitate and encourage local participation and development. right? There's been a premise out there that local companies shouldn't compete unless they are priced competitively. And the best practice on competitiveness enhancement shows that that thinking is actually quite flawed. Eric Williams, this is how we developed the downstream industry. When multinationals came to Trinidad, yes, we didn't have the wherewithal, we didn't have the technology, we didn't have the finances, we did not have the experience. But he made a decision that all of that didn't matter. We were going to spend some time developing ourselves, and therefore we have now a downstream industry that is acclaimed worldwide, respected across the world. And those are the sorts of initiatives that need to be continued in government. And local content, at least in oil and gas, it tends to be a dirty word. Maybe a lot of multinationals might think, oh gosh, we have to hire these local people, they don't necessarily have these skills. But counter to that thinking, the industry has been supported by locals. We all know that Trinidadian and Tobagonians are innovative, brilliant people. We go out in the world and we make things happen. We have Nobel laureates, etc. So in our own service industry for the oil and gas sector, we have been supporting the sector at international standards and doing quite well. So given time to grow, given that investment to prosper and develop our skills, it is something that makes sense for the country. It is also something that makes sense for multinationals, business sense, and that has been proven. BP did a study on it internally, that in the long term it makes more sense to develop the people, the local people. In the long run, it makes business sense in terms of dollars and cents. Also, the jobs that the engineers and the local companies and individuals would have, they actually add a significant amount of income to Trinidad economy. It's not just comparable to the royalties and taxes that governments make from new field developments, etc. So we all know we need dollars to be sustainable, and local content gets you there. I'm raising these points on the oil and gas industry, not because we deserve any preferential treatment, but oil and gas in Trinidad and Tobago has a significant impact on our economy and our budget. Also, the local content discussion is very mature in the oil and gas industry. We've been talking about this for quite a number of years and making steady progress. Oil and gas in the industry, we all know that the high technologies involved, very strong business processes, supply chain development practices are all encompassed in there. But what we're trying to highlight is the fact that the more participation that we have from other sectors outside of oil and gas in the oil and gas industry, be it manufacturing, be it construction, the more interaction there is the stronger that those sectors can also become. And it will help enhance and diversify the economy, especially when we're beyond the oil and gas windfall. One of the main tools that we look at for determining how government is actually spending is the budget. Now, the budget is an interesting tool because it can show you how local content policies are affecting government expenditure, and it also shows you how government is using their resources to push forward local content and sustainability. The budget will be concerned with, as we all know, spending, managing the reserves and resources, the finances that we get from the oil and gas industry, how we spend, how we invest. Things that they consider, the Minister of Finance will be considering, is how we spend the taxes that are collected. Which investors do we focus on? Which investments do we consider and not consider? And all of these things are how we can look at the sector and the economy and see if we are actually following opportunities that will help diversification and promote sustainability. Unfortunately, the budget tends to more be focused on an annual plan for a 5-year political manifesto, not so much as we would like part of a longer-term industrialization strategy that focuses on how the revenue from oil and gas can support cluster development of these other sectors. This sort of analysis is the due diligence that I was mentioning that needs to go into analyzing how we manage these revenues now. And this is important to do now because when oil and gas is done, it's done. We don't want to be caught in a situation where we're struggling when we have the opportunity to embrace this in a proactive way now. Considerations that would go into this analysis is whether or not we extract resources, the timing of exploration and production, because we need to foresee the plans that we would have for the economy in the short, medium, and long term, and how production actually matches up with that. If we're producing at a rate that is too fast, then all of that needs to be considered to make sure that we're actually sustainable. The investment projects that we support, is it necessary to support a dimethyl ether plant, which is currently being built right now? All of those are considerations that need to be taken into place. In terms of the government spend and that management of resources, as I mentioned, tax collection also needs to be maximized. If we're not capturing the resources in the first place, we're not going to be... Blue means how many minutes? 5 minutes. Okay, thanks. We're not going to be targeting sustainable practices. A lot of other countries that have developed, that are focusing on sustainability, also invest money from whatever sectors it is that are supporting them. In our case, it's oil and gas. They would invest them in sovereign wealth funds. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. And that might be a good avenue for us to invest in instead of, as we typically and traditionally do, sending your money and investing in the US stock exchange and in foreign infrastructure investments. Now, that also has to be tied to transparency and accountability. We would all know, you all would probably be more familiar in the construction industry when there was an influx of Chinese workers. I would hardly say, let's take some money from our Heritage and Stabilization Fund and invest in the construction industry unless accountability and transparency practices are put in place to make sure that the money we invest in is actually going to building our economy and our people. Now, this is not, this sort of analysis and sustainable thinking is not something that's new for us. Just around independence, there was a commission of inquiry set up into the oil and gas sector in 1963. And the findings from this commission actually have driven and affected the legislation and the policies from that time to the early 90s. And they set us up on a path for development. So some of the questions that were asked during this commission were, has there been just division of proceeds of the national heritage? To what extent have we been undertaking training of our nationals to further exploit the resources in the national interest? To what extent have there been plans for development of the industry, and how far has that been coordinated in the holistic development plan for the nation? These are the sorts of questions that we need to be asking now, because it is an important time in Trinidad's economy. The decisions we make now, as seen before, are going to be affecting us not just for 10 years, for up to 50 years. So this sort of analysis is what we as individuals, we as companies need to be engaging in, encouraging the government to engage in, so that we can be putting proper legislation and regulation in place now for the future. Some of the actions taken so far by the Trinidad and Tobago Local Content Chamber, they've had quite a number of conferences, annual conferences, to highlight opportunities to build local capacity and to engage in new activities in the oil and gas sector. that fall in line with the government's goals of increasing production and reserves. They've also made recommendations to the government on the local content participation policy. And in 2014, they had a conference on local content to highlight the successes that we have been making both locally and globally. And again, we've been encouraging the government to ensure transparency and accountability in legislation, in reporting, example in the local content and capacity development performance of the ministries themselves. And some of this has been passed into law. This here is a little bit on the Public Procurement and Disposal of Public Properties Act, which facilitates and supports local content, capacity building, and participation. It just goes through a little bit of what the terms are and who is involved as a public body and has responsibility for pushing local content forward. Okay, I think that's it for my presentation, and I hope today that I was able to highlight the importance of local content in sustainable development. I hope that I was able to highlight that this is an issue that needs to be handled now, not later, so that while we do have a thriving oil and gas industry, we can support that knowledge transfer to the support sectors so that they in turn can develop to the point where they are the leading sectors that take us into the next century. So I would encourage you in your discussions with your friends, with your colleagues, with your business partners, with the government to have this topic brought to the fore, because it is actually quite important for sustainability and the sustainability of us, our nation, our people, our economy. So thank you very much for your attention, especially after lunch. Any questions?
Thank you, Michelle. And can you just hold on for Harish?
Yeah, good afternoon, Harish Ramratan, Atlantic, LNG. So when we talk local content, sustainability, one of the elements is people,
Definitely.
right? Do we have data currently, and you mentioned an important word there, knowledge transfer, right? Do you have data currently that, that guides us in terms of how effective, how has our system been where we normally have local understudies that understudy expats who come in as part of multinationals and supporting their implementation? How effective has that been?
Well, I remember when, early in the industry, when I was getting started, I heard of these such programs, example in Petrotrin, where you would have an experienced expat who, early in the game, when they were here running the industry, you'd have one expat, and then you're supposed to automatically have someone, a local, being trained under them. From all that I've heard, that seems to have been phased out. I don't know what data or who's collecting data on that particular thing, but I know that in some of the multinationals, just from friends, there is a bit of that knowledge transfer going on, but again, it depends on what level the locals are being able to engage at. A lot of my mentors who are seniors in the oil and gas industry have actually left Trinidad and Tobago because you reach a glass ceiling. And I'm talking about brilliant people with years of experience in the industry. There's so far that you can go in a multinational company. Beyond a certain management level, you're not even necessarily allowed to engage. There's also a situation where you have local company heads, but a lot of the decision making is being done out of Houston, out of London. So you're more just of a face. So that's a serious problem, and that is the sort of thing that needs to be addressed when we define local content.
See Dr. Sami?
Yes, George Sami, Eco Engineering. I've been noticing two problems with respect to local content. And unlike you who were talking about problems from the buyer's side, I'm talking about problems from the seller's side. What I'd like to do is just describe them and see if you are having a similar situation in the oil industry. First one has to do with civil engineering. Far too many of our graduates come out of university and see success as becoming a manager. So that right now, most bids that go in for a highway that will involve a multi-span bridge, the design of that multi-span bridge has to be sourced outside because the locals have not developed the skill. That's one problem. The second problem that I'm noticing a lot in environmental engineering, which is the field I'm practicing now, let me put in Trinidad balance, hang in your hat where your hand can reach. So the gentleman comes from the US and says, I would like to have an environmental site assessment done. And in his mind, an environmental site assessment is guided by protocols of ASTM. And the local person says, yes, I can do it, because the local person thinks environmental site assessment, that's a common sense thing, man. And we're seeing a lot of that problem where we are answering yes to a question that we don't understand.
Well, that goes back to, I mentioned a little bit on the fact that locals need the opportunity to participate and compete. Even if the opportunity is there, locals need the personal will to compete. You know, Trinis we go out into the world and we are leaders across all sectors. But I could not tell you why in Trinidad we don't take the drive to do that. As a recent student, myself, you're thrust into the technical. You know, if you have some brains, you become a doctor, lawyer, engineer. There's not a lot of encouragement to run your own business. And really the distinction between being a manager and being a director or being an owner of your company, I think I've been exposed to that only because I engage at that level and realize what we aren't being allowed to engage in. So it may be just that we have the lack of information and there's not a national drive for local content and local content at a high level of the pyramid. Because look at Trinidad compared to Brazil. When you hear Brazil, you think local content at all levels. It may be a bit too much, maybe stifling investment, but I believe it's a cultural thing. And that's why the government has a large role to play in supporting that, but I do believe that we also need to carry that discussion forward.
Thank you. We have room for just one more question. One question, that is, no parts.
Thank you, Chairman. It's just Harish, how are you? The petrochemical sector local content is well documented. There aren't any expert from Yara, I think maybe Yara, coming right up to what Lisa Snyder. All those companies have been run by locals. I'm a beneficiary of that. Yeah. I've been the deputy managing director of PCS Nitrogen from the very beginning, where we acquired all the skills and the competence when Sun is sitting there. IPSL running one of the biggest petrochemical sectors maybe in the world. There are no experts. So the E&P side is probably different, where it is flooded with, literally, with experts, because either the Trinidadians don't want to go and work and take over the industry, but on land, the refineries, the petrochemical sector, and a lot of the service sector are fully, and maybe greater than 90% local. In fact, we are exporting our local to Guzman and Memphis and into wherever we are setting up petrochemicals. But the E&P side need to be documented, and that is where we have to make our impact.
I would definitely agree with you because we brought down some Nigerians who actually wanted to develop a FPSO project in their country. And I had the opportunity to meet with Tony Paul, the heads of IPSL, and I was actually blown away at how impressive and how rich the local content is in the downstream sector. So I definitely take that comment and, give kudos because, as you rightly said, it probably is a little more difficult because foreign investors have their money more directly in upstream, so there would be that competition for control. But definitely the downstream sector is an example of where we should be. And as I mentioned, Eric Williams' decision to go that road and to make sure that we had a downstream sector that was strong and vibrant and able to be an example internationally is exactly what you were mentioning there. So totally agreed.
Excellent. One final word, is how do we really give our employees the space? How do we empower them? And when they are motivated, how do we inspire them? So I would like to thank Michelle. Excellent presentation. Much talked about topic.